Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 45, The History of the Cook Islands. So for today's episode, no drink. There is a brewery on the island of Rarotonga with a lager known as the Cook Islands Lager, but I don't think I can ship it out to Washington, so instead I made ikamate, a famous dish from the Cook Islands. Ikamate is similar to ceviche. It's raw fish that is marinated in limes or lemons in order to kill any potential bacteria, and served with raw onions, tomatoes, and cucumber, along with coconut cream, salt, and pepper. I also added just a little bit of red pepper flakes just for a little bit of spiciness. It's overall pretty good. The raw tuna pairs really nicely with everything, and the coconut cream gives it a nice sense of tropical smoothness. I'm not the biggest fan of raw fish, and even though I bought high-grade fish and cooked it in lime, the thought of maybe getting some food poisoning did make me slightly nervous to eat it. All of that and the cost of buying sashimi-grade fish means I'm probably not going to be having it anytime soon, but if you are a fan of ceviche, or ceviche-like dishes, this is probably something that would be right up your alley. Shock of all shocks, the Cook Islands are a series of 15 islands in the South Pacific, which explains why seafood-based dishes like ikamate are common on the islands. The Cook Islands are a part of the Polynesian region of Oceania, with Niue, American Samoa, and Tokelau all west of them, Kiribati north of them, and French Polynesia east of them. I'll talk about it later, but the Cook Islands are not a member of the UN and aren't a fully sovereign state. They have a status known as an associated state with New Zealand. Again, I will talk about this more once I finish discussing the colonial Cook Islands, but just know the Cook Islands could debatably not be considered a country or a sovereign state, and the island of Niue also shares a similar status as the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands, like many countries and islands in Polynesia, are tropical. The islands are divided between a northern group, which is typically made up of coral atolls, while the south is made up of volcanic islands. Both have small tropical forests on them, but the southern islands tend to be both larger and more densely covered by trees. The southern islands also tend to be larger in terms of population, with something like 90% of the population found in the south, with the largest island population-wise in the north, Puka Puka, having less than 500 people on it. The southern island of Rarotonga alone has roughly 2/3 of the country's population. The Cook Islands have overall something like 15 to 20,000 people in them. Most people are Cook Islands Maori, related to other Polynesian peoples like the Maori of New Zealand, Tahitians, and the Hawaiians. Most non-Maori peoples on the islands are white, most likely coming from either the UK or New Zealand, with smaller populations of non-Maori Polynesians and Asians, mostly found in Rarotonga. Around 10% of the population are also somewhat mixed, with partial European and Maori ancestry. Language-wise, most people will speak English, with it being used in business, politics, and mass media. English is particularly common in Rarotonga and the island of Palmerston, which has only 25 people on it. Many people will also speak an indigenous Polynesian language, Cook Islands Maori, which is closely related to New Zealand Maori and Tahitian. Cook Islands Maori is particularly common among the older generation and in the outlying islands. However, Maori isn't a unified language, with the Maori spoken on Rarotonga fairly distinct from the Maori spoken on Rakahanga. Puka Puka's indigenous language is so distinct it's generally seen as its own separate language, being more closely related with Samoan and Tongan than the Polynesian language spoken on Rarotonga. Religion-wise, the vast majority of the population is Christian. A Reformed church, the Cook Islands Christian Church, or CICC, is the largest denomination and historically has dominated the country. However, in more recent years, other religious denominations like Catholicism, Seventh-day Adventist, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Pentecostals have grown in strength and influence. Still, over 40% belong to the CICC. A small community of Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus are also present. Finally, around 10% are non-religious. The first settlers to the Cook Islands came sometime in the first millennium CE. Those from the southern islands came from Tahiti in the east, while Puka Puka was discovered by Polynesians coming from Samoa. The islands were divided from both each other and within many islands themselves by various ariki or high chiefs. These high chiefs would then divvy up their authority to lower subordinates, who would then administer smaller sections of land known as teperi. The culture in the Cook Islands was very similar to other Polynesian peoples, with frequent tattooing of their bodies, being expert canoe makers and wood carvers, having a form of communal land use, trading for goods with other neighboring Polynesian peoples, and practicing a form of cannibalism which seems to have been mostly reserved for enemies in war. The first settlers to New Zealand would also come from the Cook Islands. European explorers began making contact with the islands in the late 1500s, with Spanish explorers at first just passing the islands. In 1773 and again in 1777, the British captain James Cook would first spot the southern islands, mapping much of them for future European sailors. He would name the islands the Harvey Islands, although in 1920 a Russian explorer would choose to disregard this title and label the islands as the Cook Islands after the British captain. Europeans, however, had very little impact on the islands during these early years, only occasionally stopping by to either trade or get into fights with the locals. This would change in the 1820s. Missionaries associated with the London Missionary Society began arriving to the islands hoping to convert the population to Christianity. In this regard, they were incredibly successful, basically stamping out the indigenous polytheistic religion of the Cook Islanders and the CICC becoming dominant. The missionaries, and in particular their native followers, would de facto rule the islands. Traditional chiefs, while not being removed, lost most of their influence as many joined the church for social advancement. The Christians, with the guidance of missionaries, quickly tried to implement Christian values on the native society of the islands, discouraging the telling of oral legends, or histories, destroying many native artifacts, destroying communal meeting areas, and ending the practice of cannibalism. Those who failed to live up to these new standards were fined and forced into being essentially de facto slaves, as a massive police state was built as some islands had over 5% of the entire population made up of policemen. Many churches were built during this time and still exist today, and Western education and schooling was brought to the islands. Women also managed to see some social advancement during this time, as many men who wanted to gain political power moved into the church hierarchy, which left women to play a greater role in traditional political roles, with the 1880s seeing many women in powerful political roles. Church rule in the 19th century would also see the Cook Islands integrate into the wider world. Ships from Europe began to more frequently visit and trade with the islands, bringing 19th century goods and foodstuffs to the islands. Some Europeans also moved to the islands during this time, with many British and New Zealand merchants moving into the region, but it brought, more importantly, disease to the islands. The Cook Islanders had mostly been protected by old world diseases due to their isolation, but as contact increased with the outside world, many fell ill and died. Something like 1/3 of all people on Rarotonga would die from disease in the mid-19th century. Those who survived would have to deal with blackbirders in the 1860s. Blackbirders were mainly Peruvians, although other South Americans, Australians, Americans, and New Zealanders also participated in the blackbirding business. Blackbirders would travel to the Cook Islands or other islands in the Pacific and convince locals to come with them to work on their ships or work on plantations further afield far from their homes. While some Cook Islanders did take them up on this offer consensually, most were just straight up kidnapped, forced into de facto slavery. This hurt the population even more, as many families were torn apart and some small islands were almost entirely depopulated. It was in this environment that colonial rule began to take shape. In Tahiti and the Society Islands, France began expanding its influence, leading to brutal wars with the native Polynesians. Cook Islanders, fearing French invasion and all that would entail, began looking towards the UK and New Zealand for aid, seeing as many Kiwis and Brits lived on the islands, so they thought rule under them would more likely keep the status quo in check. In 1888, the most powerful Ariki of Rarotonga, Makea Takao Ariki, asked for the British to turn her island into a British protectorate, to protect it from invasion. British rule would then expand to the other southern islands, and within a decade, all islands that now make up the Cook Islands would be under British rule. British rule, while it wouldn't fundamentally change life on the islands, would see some important transformations and developments. The political power women had built up over the past decades was eroded as white bureaucrats took most of the political power, leaving the Ariki in an even more symbolic role. The church's role in the islands would also change, as freedom of religion was encouraged, leading to new missionaries and groups like the Catholics to gain a foothold in the region. The Cook Islands were overall ignored by the British, largely because the Cook Islands were without major natural resources, with the colony's economy mostly being based around agricultural products or fishing. They were taken by the British largely to prevent another colonial power from taking it, and thus potentially harming some other colonial projects the British had, and also likely to partially further the British ego, and really cement the sun never sets on the British Empire mentality. Increasingly, New Zealand began to play a bigger role in the Cook Islands. Actually, in the 1860s, Cook Islanders asked for New Zealand to take them over, wanting to be incorporated into the fledgling Dominion. However, this seemed to have somewhat changed by the late 1800s, with Cook Islanders wanting to not fall under New Zealand overlordship, perhaps fearing they might suffer the same fate as New Zealand's Maori population, maybe just fearful of any change that might upset the status quo, or even just dislike towards New Zealand administrators. My sources weren't really clear on this, so I don't 100% know the reason for the disdain or the distrustfulness. Regardless, after much backdoor wrangling, in 1901, The Cook Islands were placed under New Zealand's control, which to a certain extent the islands have remained under until today. New Zealand's rule continued to see the islands ignored, as many New Zealanders barely paid attention to this small island colony that was thousands of miles away from its shores. Some limited infrastructure projects took place, with World War II seeing a series of airports built on the islands, but fairly little reform was actually carried out. The economy continued to be largely agricultural based, with products like coconut, tea, coffee, oranges, passion fruit, tomatoes, and pineapples all being important agricultural products for the islands, although they failed to bring in a lot of wealth into the country. World War II, besides seeing more airports built, also saw emigration out of the islands, with many Cook Islanders moving to New Zealand for work in factories. Today, more Cook Islanders live in New Zealand than live in the Cook Islands, due to immigration during this time and in future decades. After World War II, important political reforms began to be introduced. A legislative council was set up in 1946, setting the stage for democracy and internal governance. Slowly, a nationalist movement began to emerge, demanding greater rights for the islands, more autonomy, opposing European dominance, and more economic justice. Initially, these nationalists faced an uphill battle, as many in the islands believed they couldn't become independent, seeing as they were so small, didn't have the economy to become profitable, and they feared emigrating to New Zealand would become tougher for most people. This started to change in the 60s as Albert Henry came onto the scene. Henry helped found the Cook Islands Party, or CIP, and with his oratory skill, charm, and his anti-establishment message, began gaining supporters, and support for Cook Islands' autonomy soared. Starting in 1963, New Zealand began planning for some sort of independence for the country, and in 1965, the Cook Islands became an associated state with New Zealand, and elections were held which had Henry's CIP winning a majority of seats. Henry was also knighted by the Queen during this time. Briefly, before we continue on with the Cook Islands history and Henry's government, we should stop and ask, why isn't the Cook Islands a UN member state? Is the Cook Islands independent? And what is an associated state? The definitions of what a country is very, very complicated. Soon I intend to make an episode asking what makes a place a country. But for now, I'll just note that generally, what I've seen, a lot of websites refer to it as a country, and in the book Cook Islands History and Tourism by Alphonse Boys, which gives a very basic but still informative overview of Cook Islands history, it describes the islands as gaining independence in 1965. The islands are in an associated state status with New Zealand, something that is also shared by the island of Niue, again with New Zealand. Countries like the Marshall Islands, the FSM, and Palau also are in that status with the United States, although the exact terms are a little bit different. Associated status for Niue and the Cook Islands means that while the two are autonomous from New Zealand and can sometimes conduct their own foreign policy, the New Zealand government can, with consent from the Cook Islands government, govern and influence their foreign or defense policy. You will also see later that New Zealand can actually play a role influencing domestic politics on the islands. Cook Islanders are also allowed to immigrate to New Zealand and automatically gain New Zealand citizenship, while New Zealand gives financial aid to the islands. The Cook Islands are an associated state and is mostly autonomous but still with New Zealand's influence. Generally, this is how most people view it, as a sort of half country, half territory, similar to places like Greenland, Aruba, or the Isle of Man. Many countries actually do have some sort of diplomatic relations with the Cook Islands, and the Cook Islands represent themselves in several UN organizations, although not actually in the UN itself. Recently, in 2023, America recognized the Cook Islands and Niue as sovereign states, with plans to invest more in the region to increase America's influence in Oceania. It's possible in the future, states who want to have a greater role in the region might try recognizing the Cook Islands and Niue as sovereign states to better play the game of geopolitics. I think it's overall fair to describe them as independent, although due to the weird definition of what a country is or isn't, I think it could be considered a country, but also not a country at the same time. But enough finger-wagging on country status and geopolitical terms, let's return to 1965. Henry became the island's first prime minister and initially proved to be massively popular. He increased government spending and the number of government jobs, built the international airport on Rarotonga, and promoted the Cook Islands as an independent state, with a new green flag with 15 yellow stars representing the 15 islands of the country. Henry also treated his role as head of the country as absolute. Any who criticized his role could face being fired, and he built up a very clientelistic power base, appointing many family members and friends in key roles. Opposition began to mount, with the Democratic Alliance Party, or DAP, being formed, made up of liberal opposition to Henry and the CIP. In the 1978 election, the CIP and the DAP would face off, with the CIP ultimately emerging with more seats. However, after it was revealed that the CIP won by bribing Cook Islanders living abroad to return to the islands to vote, many CIP members defected to the DAP, which led to the DAP under Thomas Davis to take charge. Henry was stripped of his knighthood and died shortly afterwards, which has been a historically contentious decision, seen by CIP supporters as Britain stripping the Cook Islands of its prestige. The 80s would see the Cook Islands fought over by the DAP and the CIP, now led by Albert Henry's cousin, Geoffrey Henry. Some symbols of CIP rule were removed, with the flag being transformed into its current iteration with the Union Jack on the top left, and the national anthem was changed. Once Henry took power in 1989, he started to spend more money on cultural institutions with more funding for museums. The Cook Islands before the 90s was known for high government spending. Aid from New Zealand, along with profits from the agricultural sector and the growing tourism sector, did help reduce the deficit a little bit, but both sectors failed to bring in a whole lot of wealth, and the Cook Islands continued to borrow more and more money. In the mid-90s, things began to hit a wall, as a series of investments like a multi-million resort fell through and the economy took a massive nosedive. A New Zealand trade economist, Lloyd Powell, was sent in to try and straighten things out. Powell and the New Zealand government at the time was heavily influenced by Rogernomics, New Zealand's form of neoliberal reform that dominated New Zealand in the 80s. Powell and Geoffrey Henry got to work reducing government spending and cutting public sector jobs, with over half of all government employees, or 10% of the entire population, was laid off. This led to massive unemployment, and with very few opportunities to find work, many left to either New Zealand or Australia. The economy slowly started to turn around in the 2000s. Tourism, which had slowly over the decades been growing as infrastructure on the islands improved, began to become a major industry. Today, over half of the country's entire GDP is from tourism, with the country positioning itself as a tropical paradise that is undiscovered and not as packed with other tourists as places like Hawaii or Fiji. Agriculture and fishing remains an important but shrinking part of the economy, and aid from Cook Islanders living abroad also plays an important role in supplanting people's incomes. A new driver of the economy is based around offshore banking, as foreigners can put their assets into a Cook Islands bank account to prevent it from being seized by the government or be taxed at the same rate it would in their home country. This has caused controversy at several points, as many rich politicians, businessmen, and doctors in America have set up bank accounts on the islands to avoid losing their wealth when faced with an unwinnable court case in America. The Cook Islands have tried to crack down on bank accounts being used for illegal purposes, but the Cook Islands still have a bit of a reputation when it comes to offshore banking. After Geoffrey Henry stepped down in 1999, the DAP retook power, although they experienced some infighting leading to some breakoffs, and the party eventually being reformed into the Democratic Party. The Liberal bloc held onto power in the country until 2010, when the CIP would return to power, which they still maintain. In 2020, the current Prime Minister, Mark Brown, would take power and has pushed for seabed mining offshore, hoping to diversify the Cook Islands economy. The politics of the Cook Islands are overall dominated by the CIP and the Democratic Party. Other parties do exist, like the United Cook Islands Party, but overall, a two-party system dominates the country. The islands are politically relatively stable, and when compared to many of their neighbors, are fairly democratic and free, with free press and without unelected chiefs completely dominating political life. That being said, the Cook Islands economically, while it is better off than it was in the 90s, is still fairly weak, and if tourism ever dried up, the islands would be in serious trouble. The fact that the islands are spaced out far away from each other does pose a big logistical challenge in connecting all the islands together, and with climate change and a lack of job opportunities on many of the smaller islands, it will be uncertain what future some of the small and far-flung islands have. Loss of culture is also occurring, as many younger people on Rarotonga aren't speaking the indigenous language, and many have chosen an easier life of relying on food exports rather than self-sufficient farming. The fact of the matter is, the Cook Islands have a fairly small population, far from any major population centers, with the closest city with 1 million people in it being Auckland, New Zealand, almost 2,000 miles away, which makes it a challenge to build up the country. Regardless, more international recognition might lead to more opportunities for the islands and hopefully a stronger base to build off of. So why does the Cook Islands exist? The Cook Islands as a political unit were created by the British to prevent French expansion in the Pacific in the 1800s. However, the people of the islands settled the islands far before then and managed to build a society for themselves despite living in relative isolation from many other parts of the world. While not a UN member, they may over the next coming years or decades be labeled as a country more and more, and therefore may come onto the international spotlight as a fully sovereign state. Up next, we will go to Costa Rica, prepare for the Spanish, a Central American superstate, and a surprisingly peaceful 20th century. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. The Cook Islands are really interesting because they're one of those states that is debatably a country, but also it isn't a super controversial question, like how debatably Kosovo or Taiwan are countries. The argument over whether the Cook Islands is a country is based a lot more on just how you define a country and how complicated that term and terminology is. I know that'll be an upcoming episode, but for right now, my next couple kind of short list of episodes, up next I will do Indonesian political parties. I've gotten a decent chunk of the script done, but I'm guessing it's probably going to take another 1 to 2 weeks after this episode releases before I'm fully done with the script for that. Then I will do the history of Costa Rica, and then I will do Argentine parties. Also, want to give a shout out to my Patreons. Shout out to Terry O'Hara for the donation on PayPal. Really, really appreciate it. And if you want to talk to me at all, you can email me at whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I used for this episode were Alfonso Boy's book, Cook Islands History, Tourism, People, Culture, and Tradition, Cook Islands tourism video about the Cook Islands, ICIJ article, Paradise of Untouched Assets, Journeyman picture documentaries, Trouble in Paradise as Cook Islands Struggle with Debt, New Zealand Herald article, Aitutaki, Cannibal Spirit Lives On, New Zealand's National Film Unit documentary, The Cook Island Looks Ahead 1965, Sky News Report, Cook Islands PM Defends Seabed Mining, Tagata Pacifica's documentary, Cook Islands 50th Year Anniversary of Self-Government 2015, and then their video Cook Islands Migration, the Coconut TV's video, Women of Power, Makea Taku Ariki, and finally, Wikipedia.